At exactly 9:14 UTC, 48 hours ago, something happened in the vast emptiness of deep space that defies every known law of physics. This event wasn't a natural occurrence, it was deliberate. When the signal was first picked up by the Deep Space Network facility in Canberra, Australia, the immediate analysis showed something chilling. This wasn't a comet breaking apart due to stress or the force of the sun. This was something calculated, precise, and eerily controlled. For months, astronomers had tracked an object known as 3IATLAS. At first, it seemed like a typical interstellar object, cold and dormant, moving in a stable trajectory through the solar system. There was nothing about it that suggested anything extraordinary. But that all changed on February 27th when Atlas crossed the frost line, roughly 450 million kilometers from Earth. What should have been just another comet passing through our solar system turned into a strange and unsettling event. Rather than breaking apart, like most comets do when they reach the inner solar system, 3I, Atlas executed a highly unusual maneuver. It didn't fracture. Instead, it split cleanly into two equal bodies. From that point on, these two new objects were labeled Atlas Alpha and Atlas Beta. Here's where things took a turn for the strange. In a natural breakup, momentum would cause the fragments to spread apart gradually, drifting away in loosely aligned paths. But this wasn't a random event. Atlas Alpha and Beta didn't just drift apart. They maneuvered. They accelerated in different directions, moving at precise angles. Atlas Alpha sharply banked left, adjusting its trajectory by 14 degrees, while Atlas Beta did the opposite, banking right by the same exact amount. And they didn't stop there. Both objects gained speed. This wasn't just a random event. No rock or ice in the cosmos behaves this way. For two fragments of a comet to independently change their paths in such a synchronized manner is statistically impossible. It's a scenario with a probability of less than 1 in 8 billion. As the James Webb Space Telescope was redirected 19 minutes after the split, scientists were expecting to see a cloud of debris between the two objects, the usual aftermath of a breakup. But that's not what they found. Instead of chaos and expanding dust clouds, they saw two clear, solid points of light, perfectly separated by a near vacuum. No expanding debris, no shock wave, no gas release. The separation was clean, controlled, and deliberate. This alone pushed the event from a natural phenomenon into the realm of the impossible. The data was starting to suggest something far more complex was at play, and it was no longer about explaining how the laws of physics had been bent. It was about understanding why they were being manipulated in the first place. This wasn't a simple fragmenting comet. The raw data pointed to something far beyond what anyone could have expected. Something intelligent was behind it. As the analysis continued, the complexity of what had just transpired became even more apparent. Atlas Alpha and Beta weren't just fragments of a comet. They were behaving with a precision that suggested a deliberate design. Comet fragments typically disperse haphazardly after a breakup, scattering into space with erratic orbits. But Atlas Alpha and Beta didn't follow that chaotic pattern. Instead, their movement was synchronized, as if they were following a set plan, one that had been carefully calculated long before their sudden separation. In the hours that followed the split, scientists continued to observe the behavior of both objects. As expected, Atlas Alpha stabilized its rotation almost immediately, locking its axis perpendicular to the sundial. This positioning maximized the object's exposure to solar radiation, effectively turning it into a passive sail that could be propelled by solar pressure. This was a known maneuver in space exploration, but it was never seen in natural celestial bodies, only in spacecraft designed with such a purpose. At the same time, Atlas Beta behaved in the exact opposite manner. It aligned its surface to minimize exposure to the sun, reducing its thermal footprint and becoming harder to detect. This made it difficult to track, allowing it to remain under the radar while Atlas Alpha drew attention. One object became bright and visible, the other dark and elusive. It was a perfect example of contrast two fragments working together, each with its own specialized role. What was even more unsettling was the speed at which these objects were moving. As they separated, they were accelerating at an astonishing rate, quickly creating a growing gap between them. The distance between Atlas Alpha and Beta increased by over 12,000 kilometers per hour. Such rapid motion, especially in two objects that should have been drifting apart under natural forces, was simply not possible without external influence. This wasn't just a cosmic coincidence. It was as though someone or something was pulling the strings. The precise trajectories, the opposing strategies, and the synchronized movement made it clear. These two objects were not drifting aimlessly through space. They were operating, and they were doing so with purpose. But there was more to uncover. 6 hours after the separation, the Deep Space Network began to notice something new. Atlas, Alpha, and Beta weren't just moving, they were communicating. And that subtle shift in behavior marked a turning point in the investigation. The discovery of the communication signal would change everything. As Atlas Alpha and Beta continued their seemingly coordinated movement, something else emerged, an anomaly in the silence of space. Space, at these vast distances, is never truly quiet. Even in the darkest reaches, particles, gas, and cosmic radiation fill the void. But between these two objects, there was an eerie absence of noise, a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the space between them had been cleared on purpose. Then, the unexpected happened. 6 hours after their separation, the Deep Space Network's instruments began picking up a pattern of movement in the space between Atlas Alpha and Beta. This wasn't random drift or the effect of natural forces. It was something far more organized. There was no dust, no expanding gas cloud, just two objects moving apart in a way that defied conventional physics. Then a breakthrough. At 20 UTC, the data began to show something that could no longer be dismissed as a natural phenomenon. Atlas Alpha's light curve, which tracks its brightness over time, had flattened into a clean, repeating pattern. This wasn't just a random fluctuation. The object was rotating in a perfectly coordinated manner, adjusting its orientation and position in space with remarkable precision. At the same time, Atlas Beta was doing the opposite. Its rotation slowed and its surface temperature remained constant. The dark side of Beta made it more difficult to track, but the data showed a clear pattern. Atlas Beta was also maneuvering, aligning itself with a purpose, but in a way that kept it hidden from prying eyes. These two objects were not simply drifting. They were responding to each other, communicating, and working together in a way that defied all natural expectations. As the days passed, this was confirmed even further. The two objects weren't just moving apart, they were adjusting their trajectories in a way that seemed almost synchronized. And this wasn't just by coincidence. This was calculation, and it seemed like someone or something was guiding them every step of the way. And then came the most startling revelation of all, the signal. When Green Bank Observatory in West Virginia picked up a narrowband radio emission from the space between Atlas Alpha and Beta, the implications were clear. This was no ordinary cosmic noise. The frequency, centered at 1.42 gigahertz, was the hydrogen line, a frequency that, in radio astronomy, is considered the water hole, a narrow band of space in the radio spectrum that natural sources don't typically use. This frequency, typically used for communication, was not just emitting randomly, it was deliberate, and it wasn't aimed at Earth. The signal was directed laterally from alpha to beta, confirming the objects were indeed communicating. What followed was even more bizarre. The pulse of the signal matched the exact rotation period of Atlas Alpha every 4.2 seconds. Pulse, 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 pulse. It was as if Alpha was sending a message to Beta, synchronizing their movements in real time. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the signal ceased, but the message had been sent. And that's when things took another strange turn. Moments after the signal stopped, Atlas Beta, the quieter of the two objects, accelerated in the opposite direction from the Sunday. This was a non-gravitational acceleration, one that doesn't align with our understanding of physics. Without gas releases or exhaust trails, Beta was moving in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Theories about extreme solar radiation or even exotic forces couldn't fully explain the data, but there was no doubt. Something was pushing Atlas Beta forward with immense precision. As Atlas Alpha and Beta continued their synchronized dance through space, a new mystery unfolded. The gap between the two objects continued to widen, and the data from tracking stations became increasingly unsettling. What started as a simple observation of two objects splitting and moving apart had now turned into something far more complex. These objects weren't just maneuvering independently, they were part of a larger system, one that was more than the sum of its parts. Despite the growing distance between Atlas Alpha and Beta, there was something else influencing their paths. Something that wasn't immediately visible. Instruments on Earth began to pick up subtle deviations in gravity itself, tiny shifts in the expected trajectory of the objects that suggested the presence of additional mass. But this mass wasn't visible through telescopes, and it wasn't detectable by infrared scans. Yet, the gravitational effects were undeniable. Something was there, exerting influence over Atlas Alpha and Beta, keeping them on their perfectly synchronized paths. This wasn't just a random cosmic anomaly. The tracking data suggested that whatever this unseen mass was, it was playing an active role in maintaining the geometry of the system. It was as though it were stabilizing the objects, ensuring that their movements remained coordinated and precise. And the more the scientists delved into the data, the more it became clear that this wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was something designed. The most disturbing part? This hidden mass wasn't stationary. It wasn't simply acting as a passive gravitational anchor. No, it was moving to adjusting its position in relation to the objects, ensuring that their timing stayed locked. As Atlas Alpha and Beta moved apart, the hidden mass compensated, shifting to keep the system in perfect alignment. It was as if the objects weren't just interacting with each other. They were being managed with a clear intention behind every adjustment. At this point, scientists could no longer deny the implications. Whatever Atlas Alpha and Beta were, they were part of a much larger system. They weren't simply cosmic debris. They weren't just fragments of a comet. They were components of something far more intricate, something with a purpose. And just when the mystery seemed to deepen, the behavior of the system began to shift again. This time, the shift came from Atlas Alpha. After weeks of being the visible object, Alpha suddenly reduced its reflective profile. Its brightness dropped by nearly 60%, as if its surface had been reconfigured. It was as though the object was deliberately hiding its presence, dimming its light in a way that made it harder to track. This change was not just a random fluctuation, it was a calculated move. Atlas Alpha had been deliberately designed to stand out, but now it was fading into the background. The question was, why? The behavior of Atlas Beta had already raised eyebrows, but now Alpha's sudden shift suggested that the system was moving towards something bigger. The decoy was no longer playing its part. Atlas Alpha was preparing for the next phase, and the rest of the system seemed to be in sync with that goal. What was this preparation for? Was this system simply exploring our solar system, or was there something more to its presence? The data continued to build, suggesting that whatever was happening, it wasn't just about observation anymore. It was about something much more deliberate. As the situation with Atlas Alpha and Beta continued to evolve, scientists began to notice something truly baffling. The behavior of the two objects seemed coordinated, but there was still something else at play, a deeper layer of communication that had eluded detection until now. While optical and infrared telescopes were focused on the objects themselves, radio observatories were scanning the space between them. That's when a breakthrough occurred. On February 28th, just as the day was winding down, the Green Bank telescope detected something unexpected, a signal, but not from Atlas Alpha or Beta directly. The signal originated from the space between them, a location that had previously been considered empty. The frequency was a narrowband signal centered at 1.42 gigahertz, known to radio astronomers as the hydrogen line, a frequency that cuts through the cosmic noise. It's the very same frequency used to detect signals from distant stars and galaxies, but this one was different. This wasn't just background noise or a random cosmic event. The signal was narrow, stable, and coherent. It wasn't aimed at Earth. It was directed laterally from Atlas Alpha to Beta. As analysts reviewed the data, they made a chilling discovery. The signal pulsed every 4.2 seconds, precisely matching Atlas Alpha's rotation cycle. The timing was impeccable, and it was no coincidence. The pulse and the rotation were synchronized perfectly, suggesting that Atlas Alpha was sending out a signal to Beta. It was a handshake, a confirmation of their alignment and coordination. The implications were clear. This wasn't just a random phenomenon. Atlas Alpha and Beta were communicating. They were exchanging information in real time, ensuring that their movements remained coordinated. But just as suddenly as the signal began, it stopped. A silence fell between them, deeper than before. For a moment, it seemed like the communication had ended, but the scientists knew something had changed. Then, in a shocking turn of events, Atlas Beta performed a maneuver that defied classical celestial mechanics. Instead of slowing down, as it should have when moving away from the sun, Atlas Beta accelerated. This wasn't a slight acceleration. It was a dramatic increase in speed in the wrong direction. No exhaust plume, no ion trail, no gas release, just pure, unexplainable motion. This type of acceleration had been observed before, most famously with the interstellar object Oumuamua in 2017. But this was different. The acceleration observed with Atlas Beta was 400 times more significant than that of Oumuamua, and it was happening without any visible propulsion mechanism. Whatever was causing this acceleration didn't follow any known physics. It was as though a force was being applied without any observable reaction mass. The more data came in, the more it became clear. Something intelligent was behind these maneuvers. The objects weren't just behaving like rocks in space. They were acting like machines, following a carefully designed and coordinated plan. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was nothing short of extraordinary. This was no longer about observing a comet or asteroid passing through the solar system. Atlas Alpha and Beta had evolved into something far more complex, something that was operating with purpose. And as they continued to move apart, their behavior suggested that the system was not only learning, but adapting to the environment around it. As the days passed and the behavior of Atlas Alpha and Beta continued to perplex scientists, the data pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Whatever these objects were, they weren't merely passing through our solar system. They were interacting with it in a way that suggested a deliberate and calculated process. They were engaging with Earth, and that engagement was about to escalate to a level no one could have predicted. For weeks, the objects had been moving in perfect synchronization, adjusting their trajectories, communicating, and even learning. But now, a deeper level of sophistication emerged. The system wasn't just operating on its own. It was responding to Earth, measuring our technological activity, and adapting accordingly. Scientists began to notice an unsettling pattern in the telemetry from the deep space tracking stations. There was a recurring fluctuation in power consumption, subtle, yet unmistakable. It wasn't linked to the sun's radiation or any natural thermal process. It wasn't a result of rotation or orbit. It was a response to something happening on Earth. Every time a major technological event occurred on our planet, whether it was a radar sweep, a particle accelerator test, or a planetary defense drill, the signal from Atlas Alpha would fluctuate. The system was reacting to our actions, adjusting its own behavior as if it were learning from us. At first, this seemed like a mere coincidence, but the more data was analyzed, the clearer it became. The system was sampling Earth. It was measuring our electromagnetic emissions, testing how much power we could project, and learning about our capabilities. This wasn't passive observation. This was active engagement. And as the system adapted, the time lag between Earth's emissions and Atlas Alpha's response shrank. What had started as a few seconds delay in response time had now become milliseconds. The system was learning, and it was learning fast. By March 1st, internal models began to suggest that Atlas Alpha and Beta were no longer just observing us. They had constructed a partial electromagnetic profile of Earth, not just mapping our planet, but mapping our technological prowess. It was a chilling realization. The system was not just watching us, it was preparing for something. As the months passed, the behavior of the system continued to shift. Atlas Alpha's trajectory was subtly adjusted, bringing it into a position where Earth-based telescopes would have a clearer line of sight. It was as though the object was prompting us, as if saying, "Don't stop now." The message was clear. It was preparing for something, and that something was linked to Earth. Then came the final revelation. The system's activity didn't increase as it approached Earth. Instead, it decreased. Adjustments became smaller, emissions dropped further, and the system's behavior became more deliberate. The invisible mass that had been stabilizing Atlas Alpha and Beta shifted once again, but this time it didn't stabilize, it led. It placed itself ahead of the two objects, directly along the projected Earth intercept line. At this point, it was impossible to ignore the implications. The system had adapted. It had learned. It had waited for the right moment to act, and that moment was fast approaching. In the silence that followed, one question remained. What would happen next? The system was no longer merely passing through. It had settled into our solar system. It was interacting with us, learning from us, and preparing for something, and as the final adjustments were made, one thing was clear. Whatever Atlas Alpha and Beta were, they were no longer just objects in space. They were part of a much larger plan, a plan that involved us. And the most chilling part of all? We weren't in control. The next phase was coming, and we were already part of it. Now that you've witnessed the incredible mystery surrounding Atlas Alpha and Beta, it's clear something unprecedented is happening right under our noses. What's next for these objects, and how will they impact our future? Make sure you don't miss out on the next chapter of this unfolding cosmic story. If you want to stay updated on all the latest developments, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts on this mind-bending discovery. In the comments below, what do you think Atlas Alpha and Beta are preparing for? We'll be diving even deeper into this mystery in future videos, so don't miss out. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next video.